Natasha Bertrand is following developments for us from Washington. And Natasha, these, from what I understand on the CIA, these were authorizations. You can clear up if I'm wrong here. These were authorizations the president gave the CIA earlier this year, right? But do we know exactly what these authorizations include? In other words, is the CIA being told, hey, go after Maduro, seek regime change, or is this about combating the flow of drugs into the US?
No, Isa, that's the really key question here. I would imagine, based on our reporting, that the authorization for CIA operating in Latin America, to include Venezuela, is actually fairly broad. But the key question here when it comes to inside Venezuela itself is, are the CIA taskings really directed at getting Maduro out of power, for example, regime change activities, or are they going to be more narrowly focused on attacking cartels and drug labs and things like that really get at the heart of the U.S.'s kind of counter-narcotic campaign that it has said that it is fighting in order to stop the flow of drugs coming into the United States? We simply don't know, but we know at this point that the CIA authorization was granted by President Trump earlier this year at the same time that he gave the U.S. military those new authorities to go after counter-narcotics in the region as well. And so this was kind of all one foul swoop as part of this broader campaign in the region. But we do know that the president has not taken these kinds of regime change activities off the table. He said yesterday that he was not going to answer a question from a reporter about whether or not the CIA is going to be authorized to carry out some kind of action that might lead to Maduro's removal. However, we are told that the CIA is authorized now to carry out lethal activities, lethal targeting. So the question is, how far is that going to go? Are we going to harken back to the long history of CIA regime change activities in Latin America? Or is this going to be more narrowly focused on drug cartels? That is the big question at this point, Isa.
Yeah, and look, this authorization would normally, of course, happen behind the scenes, and we wouldn't be informed about it, right? This is covert, it would be highly classified. So really, what is at play here? I mean, how much is this simply to rattle Maduro? How effective does the administration think it can be just by, imposing itself in this way?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think a lot of what the U.S. military, anyway, has been doing down near Venezuela has been a lot of show of force. For example, we saw the B-52 bombers that were flying off the coast of Venezuela just yesterday. We have seen training exercises being carried out by the U.S. military right off the coast of Venezuela that have been very well publicized. They're not trying to hide their presence there. Now you have the president coming out and saying, look, I have authorized the CIA to actually act inside Venezuela itself, which is going to increase the sense of paranoia among Maduro and his aides there. And so you have to think that part of this is definitely a psychological operation to put pressure. But again, the CIA does now have these expanded capabilities, this expanded authorization, and it is unlikely that they are not going to take advantage of that in some way.
Yeah. So, Natasha, appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. Let's stay on this story. My next guest served as the U.S. Special Representative for Venezuela and Iran during President Trump's first term. Elliot Abrams joins the show live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Abrams, great to have you on the show. As you heard there from my colleague Natasha, tensions clearly ramping up between the United States and Venezuela. You know the country well. You were appointed special envoy to Venezuela by President Trump, I believe, in his first term. What do you make of this pressure campaign, sir, from the U.S. this time around? Do you think it can be effective, or, as Natasha was saying, is this just a show of force?
I think one of you used the term psychological operation, and I think that's right. I think it is a show of force to help along a pressure campaign against Maduro. The military presence in the Caribbean is too big for just hitting a few speedboats, though it is not big enough for an invasion of Venezuela. So what's in the middle? What's in the middle, I think, is a pressure campaign meant to rattle Venezuela and the Venezuelan regime, meant to rattle the Venezuelan military, and maybe crack the regime and see if it will finally fall. And I do think there will be strikes closer to Venezuela, within the 3-mile limit, and perhaps on land as well.
You see then strikes in Venezuela in the coming weeks, and I mean the aim to crack the regime, to dislodge Maduro, but you don't think this is about narco trafficking at all?
It is about narco trafficking, and the boats that were hit, they weren't tourist boats. I mean, it's reasonable to think they were narcotics trafficking boats. And I think the targets, if they are hit in Venezuela, will be things like airstrips where little planes go off carrying drugs, or the same kind of boats, but in port in Venezuela. So it is about narcotics trafficking, but the president seems to have taken the view that it would be good to get rid of this regime, that it's a criminal regime. He's used the word terrorism now. This is more than he ever said in the first term. So I think the ambitions have grown larger here. And it's a reasonable bet that maybe the regime will crack if enough pressure is brought to bear. If enough Venezuelans in the regime or in the military think, I don't want to be the next Noriega or the next Bashar al-Assad. Let me get out now.
It will be interesting to see if it does happen right internally within Maduro's kind of inner circle, because we have seen pressure before, perhaps not this kind of pressure, to be completely frank, in terms of military buildup and strikes on drug boats. But, we saw a pressure from President Trump. You and I have spoken before, when it was Juan Guaido was really the one that was trying to dislodge Maduro. So what is different this time round? What do you think can be more effective this time round?
Guaido had been the Speaker of the National Assembly, and the presidency we thought was vacant because Maduro had stolen the election. This time, there was an election. There's a real elected president, Edmundo Gonzalez, who just about every democracy in the world agrees was actually the elected president of Venezuela. So there is somebody who could take power, who we all believe should be in the presidential mansion in Venezuela. And the second thing is that this combination of drug questions and migration questions is bigger for the president than it was in his first term. He never did anything like this show of force in his first term.
You would have heard then, I'm guessing, given, I wonder what you think might happen in the coming weeks, because of course you heard Natasha talking about the president giving authorization to the CIA to operate in Venezuela, right? But the CIA's record really in Latin America has been somewhat mixed, whether it's Nicaragua, Chile, just to name a few. What would that look like, you think? And I mean, do we honestly think that Maduro doesn't know CIA operates inside the country? Surely we know that.
I think one thing is the CIA operations don't have to be lethal or paramilitary operations. The president may say to them, I want you to contact every Venezuelan military officer you can, clandestinely, and see if some of them are willing to rise up against Maduro. So this doesn't have to be shooting. But I would say one other thing about timing. You asked about that. You can't leave that flotilla in the Caribbean month after month after month. Those ships and those people have other things to do as well. So I think, if he doesn't take action in Venezuela.
Oh, we seem to have lost you, and I wanted to hear the answer, because I think Mr. Abrams was giving us a sense of how soon he thinks any sort of action could happen, of course. Mr. Abrams, I think you're still with us. We lost you just at the point where you were about to tell us when you think the timing when this would happen, at the critical point. Just start that sentence, if you don't mind.
Sorry. You can't leave this flotilla sitting there month after month after month. If the president doesn't do anything in Venezuela in October, it would have to be November. This cannot go into next year just sitting there not doing anything.
Right, so we've got a rough idea of time. I then wonder what other countries in the region should be applying pressure here. Yesterday on CNN, we heard from Maria Corina Machado, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, of course, who won that election with Edmundo Gonzalez, as you clearly stated. And she was asking, when she spoke to my colleague, she was asking for other countries to show support for the Venezuelan cause and to back her. where are the other countries? And we saw President Petro today kind of distancing himself, of course, from Venezuela because of the CIA operations. What do you think should happen in the region in terms of showing that support for Machado or against Maduro?
Right. But just one point. We don't know if there are, in fact, any CIA operations yet. But I think,
yes.
Look, there are a number of countries that have been very supportive of the democratic opposition. Argentina is a good example of that. There are two big ones that have stayed out of this, and that's Brazil and Mexico. And I think they're going to stay out of it because they don't want to support Maduro for democratic reasons, among others, and because they have their own problems with President Trump. They don't need to create new ones. So I think you will see most Latin American democracies distancing themselves from Maduro here. In the end, though, it doesn't matter a lot. I think what matters here is, will President Trump stick with it? How far will he go? And can people be found in the sort of outer circles of the regime or in the military who are willing to desert Maduro now?